I can think of a host of good reasons for shaping a course towards northwest Spain for a summer's cruise. The food's great, the wine's okay, the natives are generally friendly, and despite the efforts of Brussels and the euro, the fun-loving Spanish have contrived to keep prices on the right side of even. There are some interesting harbours too. One way or another, it has a lot going for it, but don't fall into the trap I've done more than once and imagine that the weather will be handing out any favours. For a start, fog has a habit of spoiling your day. Galicia isn't the sun-soaked Costa del Buzo. It's an outpost in the frowsy North Atlantic, and it generates lousy visibility like Manchester did in November before the Clean Air Act. In an era where we all fancy we know where we are, this is less of an issue than once it was. Having a pinpoint fix is cold comfort though when punting around, wondering when the next fishing boat is going to T-bone the yacht. We all know GPS is reliable, but this very confidence generates similar superstitious feelings to the ones I hold about modern diesels. Time was when engines couldn't be relied on to run and keep running. After the beast had stopped at the worst possible moments imaginable, a sailor developed a sixth sense for contingency plans. The result is that even today, when I'm motoring into port, courtesy of my excellent Yanmar, some little guy in the back of my head is nagging the bloke up front. What will you do right now if the prop stops turning? Adopting the same philosophy when it comes to GPS isn't a bad plan, and recalling one memorable landfall reminds me that when the screens go blank there is still hope. Back in the mid-1980s I was bound in towards Bayona from the Azores in my old pilot cutter. For navigation we had a well-used sextant, the usual properly swung compass, protractors, 2B pencils, and providentially a somewhat primitive radio direction finding set, known in those days as RDF. These often vilified devices delivered bearings generated loosely on a Morse radio broadcast from various lighthouses. Each offered a single line of position, which depending on range and signal quality might be accurate to anything from 5 to 30 degrees. It had been a tough run from Horta, close hauled in a stiff northeasterly most of the way. We'd had enough, and were not amused when fog descended on us as we homed in with a couple of days still to go. Navigating by the heavens, of course, if you can't see the sky, you've had your chips. So for the 48 hours leading up to probable landfall, we were thrown back onto dead reckoning. As the coast approached, I noticed that Cabo Ciliero light at the entrance to Rio de Vigo, with Bayona immediately inside, promised a likely radio beacon. There were no others in range for a cross bearing and a fix, but any PL is better than no PL, so I tuned in, caught the beeps, and plotted my first pencil line on the chart. Being well brought up, I logged the time and streamed the Walker trailing log so I'd know any future distance run. Up till then, I'd been following my usual deep-sea practice in waters where there isn't a lot to hit. I'd guess my speed by looking over the side at the water flowing by, then firm things up at noon with a fix from the sun. The radio bearing put the light safely out on my starboard bow. The depth sounder indicated no bottom, so I sailed on into the fog for an hour or so. When the log read 6, I took a second bearing, logged it and plotted it. I'd run 6 miles on a known compass heading. Any current was likely to be setting south at a modest rate, so I compensated for that and ran the first PL up to the second. This gave me a basic running fix that suggested I was still a couple of hours short of the headland. Next time I only sailed 5 miles before homing in on the friendly Morse code beeps. I plotted the third PL, but now, rather than organising my running fix from an arbitrary point on the preceding bearing, I shunted the previous fix itself up to it. The distance run came out reasonably close to the new PL and confidence increased. When I took a fourth bearing, only half an hour or so later, the distance run crossed it smack on the button. It also stacked up with my echo sounder, which had finally awakened from its ocean depth sulk and was sniffing the bottom in less than 100 metres. I knew where I was. The first thing to heave in view, 8 days out from Horta, was a statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary high on the cliffs. She was a touch close for comfort. The next sighting was of yachts moored off Bayona and a marinero in the club launch who appeared like a pantomime fairy to whisk us ashore for a refresher. We still couldn't see more than 50 yards. In a different life, in another boat, my wife Ros and I found ourselves back on the same old corner, homeward bound from North Africa. There was no problem with the visibility, but as we approached Finisterre, lightning was flickering round the horizon. About 2200, I was enjoying some lively trawler action on the radar when a large blot appeared on a steady bearing. Squall, I thought. And what a squall it was! The temperature dumped as the wind piped up to force 6 in as many seconds. With the action directly overhead shortly afterwards, the thunder was ear-shattering, and the rain had become a joined-up deluge. After the inaugural gusts, the downpour eased, but the electrical fireworks grew steadily more violent. By 0200 the lightning was continuous, and I swear the gaff cutter's 100-kilo wrought-iron tiller was glowing in the dark. Overhead, balls of fire were running haphazardly around the sky, hopping from cloud to cloud without bothering to earth out. Meanwhile, the wind boxed the compass, keeping us sweating at the sheets and blowing alternately hot and cold as the converging air masses powering this night of horror wrestled for ascendancy. The sky cleared at breakfast as we rattled past Cabo Villano at an easy 7 knots. The long-wave shipping forecast promised a wholesome southwest 5 or 6, and the prognosis held good at first, but the rising sun was flushing the clouds as red as one of Her Majesty's pillar boxes. Ros, always a cynic when offered a clement weather bulletin, made some disparaging remarks about the sky. These were to the effect that only a mug would ignore such a portent, and why didn't we pop into a handy rear until tomorrow? I wasn't for wasting a fair wind, so we swished on regardless. By afternoon, we were running into the open Bay of Biscay before a full southwesterly gale, reefed down to a rag of mainsail with the storm jib on the bowsprit end to keep the head down. Crouching in our deep cockpit, eyeballing the building seas while scalding our faces with tea that was blowing clear out of our mugs, I had plenty of leisure to contemplate the old saw. Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning. How right it is! While I was encouraging the self-steering arrangements to keep our stern to the seas, I admitted to myself that this wasn't the first time I ignored it and been caught out. When night fell, the breeze was down to 20 knots, and we clocked up an unlikely 85 miles in 12 hours. The front that caused the electrical storm had lost its identity in the arid interior of Spain, and summer weather spread across our world. 2 bright, breezy days later we raised the Ras de Seine and were tucked up safe in Douarnenez for a late supper. The ever-ready snake and pygmy pie was on the table as soon as I'd lowered the ensign. As I lit the lamps, I uttered a silent prayer for our deliverance off Finisterre, and quietly resolved never again to allow a distant forecaster to override the wisdom of the ages, especially off northwest Spain.